Elena looked me in the eye while I stood shivering in her marble foyer, telling me that Mia's medical bills weren't her problem anymore because she had a new, perfect life to protect. I had spent exactly $412,000 on Mia's kidney transplant, draining every cent of my savings and selling my beloved truck, leaving me with only $34 in my wallet. She thought she was discarding a broken man at the end of his rope, but she forgot about the massive debt of honor owed to me from a dusty construction site 20 years ago. My name is Thomas Miller. I'm 54 years old, and I've lived in this corner of Columbus, Ohio, for my entire life, while working 30 years as a lead structural construction engineer. My hands are permanently scarred from decades of handling heavy steel and concrete, but those calloused palms couldn't hold on to my family home after the mounting post-operative costs for Mia started burying me. I spent my entire career building skyscrapers designed to stand for a century, yet I somehow failed to see the deep cracks forming in my own marriage until Elena left for a millionaire. Columbus has been my home through every boom and bust, and as a foreman, I was respected for my honesty and my ability to solve any problem with a blueprint and some grit. But no amount of engineering knowledge could prepare me for the day the doctors told me that my 8-year-old daughter, Mia, was facing total kidney failure and needed an immediate, expensive transplant. Elena was already gone by then, having filed for divorce the moment my small construction firm started struggling during the last economic downturn that hit our Midwestern city harder than most people realized. I stayed in our modest 3-bedroom house, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for Mia, while the medical bills began to stack up like cordwood and the collection notices became a daily occurrence. The initial surgery alone cost more than I had earned in the last 5 years, but there was never a moment's hesitation in my mind about what I had to do for my only child. I signed the papers to sell our family home on a Tuesday afternoon, watching 30 years of memories and equity vanish into a bank account that was already designated for the hospital's greedy billing department. We moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in a part of town where the streetlights were often broken and the sound of sirens replaced the quiet crickets we had grown so used to hearing nightly. Mia never complained once, even when I had to tell her that her favorite dance classes were no longer in the budget and that her bedroom would now be a corner of our living room. I worked 14-hour days, picking up freelance drafting jobs and doing manual labor at the freight yards, coming home with a back that screamed in pain and eyes that were heavy with bone-deep fatigue. Every cent I made went toward the specialized diet Mia required and the anti-rejection medications that cost nearly $4,000 every single month just to keep her little body functioning properly in our basement. By the time the second year of post-operative care arrived, I had sold my Ford F-150, my grandfather's antique watch collection, and every piece of heavy equipment I had spent a lifetime acquiring for work. I was down to walking 3 miles to the bus stop every morning, my old boots leaking water and my coat providing very little protection against the biting wind that whipped off the Scioto River. The hospital's financial office was relentless, calling me twice a day to remind me that our outstanding balance had reached a critical level and that legal action was the next step in their cruel process. I tried to negotiate, offering them $50 a week, but the clerk on the other end of the line just sighed and told me that corporate policy didn't allow for such small payment plans. I remember sitting at our small kitchen table, staring at a final notice printed on bright red paper, realizing that I was only 3 days away from being unable to buy Mia's next vital prescription. It was then that I thought of Elena, who had recently married Julian Vane, a real estate developer who bragged in the local business journals about his multi-million-dollar acquisitions and his luxury lifestyle. I hadn't spoken to her in over 18 months, mostly because every time I reached out, she told me that her new life had no room for the baggage of her previous, failed Midwestern existence. But this wasn't about me or our failed marriage. This was about the life of the daughter she had carried for 9 months and then seemingly forgotten the moment she found a much richer man. I spent all of Wednesday cleaning my only decent suit, trying to look like the professional engineer I used to be instead of the broken, desperate father I had recently become in the city shadows. I had to borrow a car from a guy I used to work with at the site, a rusted-out sedan that smelled like old cigars and shook violently whenever it went over 40 miles per hour. As I drove toward the wealthy enclave of Upper Arlington, I felt a familiar sense of shame creeping up my neck, knowing I was going to beg for mercy from a woman who lacked it. The neighborhood was a different world, filled with manicured lawns, towering oak trees, and massive stone houses that looked like they belonged in a glossy magazine rather than a regular city in the heart of Ohio. I found her address, a sprawling estate hidden behind a set of ornate iron gates that required a security code I didn't have, forcing me to speak into a cold, metal intercom box for entry. I told the voice on the other end that I was Thomas Miller and that I needed to speak with Elena regarding an urgent family matter involving our daughter's health and immediate medical needs today. There was a long silence before the gate slowly buzzed open, allowing me to drive up a winding cobblestone path lined with expensive rose bushes that looked perfect even in the overcast morning light. I parked the rusted sedan next to a silver Porsche and a black Range Rover, feeling like an intruder in a world that was designed to keep people like me on the outside looking in. When I stepped out of the car, I noticed a security camera tracking my every move, and for a moment, I considered turning around and walking away before I could be further humiliated by her. But then I thought of Mia's pale face and the way she tried to hide her pain from me, and I straightened my shoulders and walked up the wide stone steps to the front door. A woman in a crisp uniform opened the door before I could even ring the bell, informing me that Mrs. Vane was currently in the middle of her morning yoga and would be out shortly. She led me into a grand foyer with ceilings so high they made me feel small, the floor made of white marble that was polished to such a shine I could see my own reflection. I stood there for 20 minutes, clutching my folder of medical records, listening to the distant sound of soft music and the occasional chime of a clock that sounded like a heavy funeral bell ringing. When Elena finally appeared, she wasn't wearing yoga clothes, but a tailored silk dress that clung to her in a way that screamed wealth and a life completely devoid of any real physical labor or struggle. She didn't offer a greeting or a smile, but instead checked her diamond-encrusted watch and told me that she only had 5 minutes before her personal stylist arrived for her afternoon session at the house. I opened the folder and tried to show her the latest bills, explaining that Mia's condition was stable, but that the cost of the medication had spiked due to a change in the manufacturer's pricing. I told her I needed $5,000 by Friday, promising that it was a loan and that I would work every weekend for a year to pay her back with every cent of interest earned. Elena didn't even look at the papers. She just pushed them away with one manicured finger and told me that she was tired of being my personal ATM every time I failed at my life. She said that if I had been smarter with my business, I wouldn't be in this position, and that she wasn't responsible for the fact that I had chosen a career that she considered obsolete. I reminded her that I was an engineer, not a failure, and that the only reason I was broke was because I had spent every penny ensuring our daughter had a chance to actually live. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of expensive peppermint, and whispered that she had already done her duty by giving birth to Mia, and that the rest was entirely my responsibility from now on. "You're a loser, Thomas," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And I'm not going to let your pathetic desperation ruin the reputation I've built with Julian and his wealthy family today." She suggested that if things were really that bad, I should just give Mia up to the state, claiming that the foster system probably had better insurance coverage than a broke, aging construction worker like me. I felt a surge of white-hot anger, but I forced myself to stay calm for Mia's sake, asking her one last time to look at the photos of her daughter and reconsider her cruel, heartless decision. She laughed and called for the security guard, a man named Marcus who looked like he had spent his entire life in a gym, and told him to remove the unauthorized solicitor from the property. Marcus grabbed my arm with a force that was unnecessary, dragging me toward the front door while Elena stood there and watched with a look of bored indifference that cut much deeper than her words. I was shoved out onto the stone porch just as the first drops of rain began to fall, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind me with a finality that felt like a cold stone tombstone. I walked back to the rusted sedan, the rain quickly turning into a downpour that soaked through my suit jacket and made the medical folders in my hand turn into a soggy, useless mess of ink. The car wouldn't start at first, the battery protesting against the cold, and I sat there in the driver's seat and finally let the tears fall, feeling completely and utterly defeated by the world today. When the engine finally sputtered to life, I drove out of the estate and down toward the main road, my vision blurred by the rain and the realization that I had failed my little girl. 2 miles away from the gates, the old sedan finally gave up the ghost, the engine smoking and dying in the middle of a busy intersection, while other cars honked and swerved around my misery. I managed to push the car to the side of the road and started walking toward the nearest bus stop, my head down and my heart heavy with a grief that felt like solid lead. I sat on the wet bench of the bus shelter, shivering as the wind picked up, watching the world go by while I tried to figure out how to tell Mia the truth tomorrow morning. The rain was coming down so hard now that I could barely see the streetlights, and I felt a sense of isolation that was more profound than anything I had ever experienced in my life. I must have sat there for an hour, lost in my own dark thoughts, before I noticed a pair of very bright headlights approaching slowly through the mist and the heavy gray rain clouds above. A massive midnight blue vehicle pulled up to the curb, its presence commanding and silent, looking like a dark ghost that had appeared out of the storm to witness my final desperate hour on that street. It was a Rolls-Royce, a car that cost more than the house I had sold, and for a moment I thought it was Julian coming to mock me one last time before I finally disappeared. But the man who stepped out of the back seat wasn't Julian. He was much older, with a shock of white hair and a face that looked like it was carved from weathered, ancient oak. He didn't have an umbrella, and he didn't seem to care that his expensive suit was getting ruined as he walked toward the bus shelter with a steady, purposeful gait that felt strangely familiar to me. He stopped a few feet away from me, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face, and then he spoke my name in a voice that was both surprised and deeply, emotionally moved in the rain. "Thomas Miller? The Thomas Miller who worked the Riverside site back in '98? He asked, and suddenly the fog in my mind began to clear as a very old, buried memory finally surfaced for me. I saw a younger version of this man pinned under a collapsed crane, his leg crushed and his life slipping away while the rest of the crew ran for cover during the massive summer storm. I remembered how I had crawled into the wreckage, ignoring the groaning metal and the smell of leaking fuel, and stayed with him for 3 hours until the rescue teams could cut him out safely. This was Arthur Sterling, a man who at the time was just a struggling developer, but who had since become one of the most powerful and influential billionaires in the entire Midwestern region of America. He reached out and grabbed my shoulder, his hand warm and solid, and told me that he had been looking for me for years to properly thank me for saving his life that terrible day. Arthur looked at my soaked clothes and the folder of ruined papers, and he asked me what on earth had happened to the man who was once the bravest engineer he had ever known back then. I told him the short version of the story, my voice cracking as I mentioned Mia and the transplant and the woman who had just told me that our daughter's life wasn't her problem anymore. Arthur's eyes turned cold and hard, a look I imagined he used when he was about to destroy a competitor, and he told me that no friend of his would ever suffer like this again. He insisted that I get into the Rolls-Royce, telling his driver to head straight to the hospital while he picked up his phone to make a series of urgent and very private legal calls. As we drove, I watched the rain blur the windows, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel cold. I felt a strange and burgeoning sense of hope returning to my tired heart. Arthur looked at me and said that he had a very long memory for debts of honor, and that by the time the sun came up, my life was going to change forever today. Inside the car, Arthur told me that for 20 years, he had kept a special fund set aside in my name, a reward for the man who saved his life when everyone else ran. We arrived at the medical center, and I watched as the hospital administrator, the same man who had threatened me with legal action yesterday, practically tripped over himself to welcome Arthur Sterling today. Arthur didn't even look at the man. He just handed him a corporate black card and told him that every single debt under the name of Thomas Miller was to be cleared immediately and permanently. I walked into Mia's room, and for the first time in months, I didn't have to pretend that everything was fine because I knew with absolute certainty that her future was finally safe and secure. Mia looked at the giant stuffed bear Arthur's driver brought in and then at me, her eyes widening as she realized that her tired, broken father didn't look quite so broken anymore in this light. While Mia slept, Arthur sat with me in the private lounge and explained that he wasn't just a developer anymore, but the majority shareholder in the firm where Julian Vane worked as a junior partner. He had been watching Julian's career for a while, and he had noticed some very suspicious patterns in the way Julian acquired distressed properties from vulnerable families like mine in the city of Columbus. Arthur called in his lead attorney, a sharp woman named Sarah, and instructed her to begin a full forensic audit of every real estate transaction Julian Vane had signed in the last 5 years of business. I told him about the mansion and how Elena had treated me, and Arthur just smiled a cold, thin smile and said that pride always goes before a very expensive and public fall from grace. He offered me a position as the chief consultant for his new urban renewal project, a role that came with a salary that made my previous engineer's pay look like pocket change to a child. I spent the next few days in a luxury hotel suite near the hospital, finally sleeping in a bed that didn't have springs poking through the thin, worn-out mattress I'd used for many months. Arthur's team moved Mia to a private wing with the best specialists in the country, ensuring she had 24-hour care and the newest treatments that I could never have dreamed of affording for her life. As I sat in my new office, Sarah walked in with a thick stack of documents that proved Julian had been illegally skimming from his investors to fund Elena's lavish and ridiculous lifestyle in Ohio. Even more shocking was the discovery that the land Elena's mansion sat on had actually been part of an old estate I had helped survey and secure for a client nearly 3 decades ago today. There was a specific clause in the original deed, one that I had personally helped draft, which stated the property could only be owned by someone with a clean legal and ethical record in business. If the owner was found guilty of financial fraud, the entire estate would revert back to the original trust, which was now controlled by a charitable foundation headed by Arthur Sterling's private investment group. I realized that Elena's house of cards wasn't just built on greed, it was built on a legal foundation that was about to crumble the moment we filed our findings with the county clerk's office. Meanwhile, Elena was busy planning a massive gala to celebrate Julian's latest acquisition, unaware that the man she had kicked out in the rain was now holding the keys to her entire comfortable world. I received an invitation to the gala, not because Elena wanted me there, but because Arthur was the guest of honor and he insisted that his new chief consultant accompany him to the event tonight. I spent a lot of money on a custom-tailored suit, standing tall and proud as the tailor adjusted the sleeves, feeling the weight of my dignity returning with every single stitch they made for me. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the shivering man from the bus stop. I saw the engineer who had built a city and the father who had saved his young daughter's life. Arthur picked me up in a different car, a vintage model that roared with power, and we drove toward the estate. I had been humiliated at just 2 short, life-changing weeks ago in the rain. The security gates opened instantly this time, the guards recognizing the Sterling crest on the hood and bowing as we glided up the cobblestone path toward the bright, flickering party lights in the distance. Elena was standing at the top of the stone steps, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my old truck, greeting guests with a fake smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. When she saw Arthur, she rushed forward with her hands outstretched, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she thanked him for gracing their humble, expensive home with his legendary presence at the gala. Then her gaze shifted to me, and I watched the color drain from her face as she struggled to reconcile the man in the designer suit with the beggar she'd evicted from her home. She asked me how I had managed to get past the front security gates without being arrested by the police immediately, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion as she stared at me. Arthur stepped between us, his voice booming with a cold authority that silenced the nearby guests, and introduced me as his most trusted business partner and the savior of his entire family and legacy today. Julian joined her, looking confused and slightly panicked as he realized that the man he had looked down upon was now standing next to the most powerful billionaire in the entire state of Ohio. We moved into the grand ballroom, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sound of a string quartet playing music that felt like a victory march for me. Arthur took the stage to give a speech, and the room went silent as everyone waited to hear what the great man had to say about the future of the local real estate market this year. He started talking about the importance of loyalty and the way a person's true character is revealed by how they treat those who have absolutely nothing to offer them in return anymore in life. Elena looked increasingly uncomfortable, fidgeting with her diamond necklace while Julian tried to maintain a confident expression that was clearly beginning to crack under the weight of Arthur's intense, piercing and judgmental gaze. Arthur then looked directly at me and told the entire room the story of the construction site accident, describing in vivid detail how I had risked my life to save a complete stranger that day. He announced that he was awarding a massive contract to my new firm, effectively making me one of the most successful and sought-after structural engineers in the entire Midwestern United States starting today. The applause was deafening, but I only had eyes for Elena, who was now staring at me with a mixture of shock, jealousy, and a sudden, desperate realization of the massive mistake she had made. After the speech, she tried to corner me in the library, her voice shaking as she claimed that she had only been testing my resolve and that she always knew I would eventually succeed. I told her that her tests were cruel and that she had failed the only one that actually mattered, which was the test of being a decent mother to her own sick and suffering child. She started crying, real tears this time, and begged me to help her because Julian's business was actually in deep trouble and they were facing a major federal investigation into their personal and corporate finances. I simply walked away, the sound of her sobbing echoing in the quiet room, feeling no satisfaction in her pain, only a deep sense of relief that I was finally free from her influence. Outside in the garden, Sarah met us with the final pieces of the puzzle, confirming that Julian had forged several signatures on the property deeds to gain control of the land under the mansion. It wasn't just a civil matter anymore. It was a criminal one, and the sheriff's office had already been notified about the evidence we had uncovered during our very thorough and long forensic audit. I looked up at the moon, thinking about Mia and how she would never have to worry about a roof over her head or the price of her life-saving medicine ever again in her life. Arthur came over and handed me a glass of sparkling cider, telling me that the next phase of our plan was about to begin and that I should enjoy this quiet, earned moment of peace. The next morning, the news was flooded with reports of the massive fraud investigation into Julian Vane's company, and his face was plastered across every single television screen in the city for all to see. I spent the afternoon at the hospital with Mia, showing her pictures of the new house Arthur had helped me find, a place with a big yard and a real garden for her to play. She laughed for the first time in weeks, a sound that was more precious to me than all the gold in Arthur's bank accounts or all the skyscrapers in the world I had built. Meanwhile, Elena was being hounded by reporters, her perfect life crumbling as her bank accounts were frozen and her wealthy friends began to distance themselves from her sinking, toxic, and very public business ship. She called me 20 times that day, her messages ranging from frantic apologies to angry demands for money, but I had already blocked her number and moved on with my new and better life. I went back to the construction site where I had saved Arthur all those years ago, standing on the same ground and reflecting on how a single moment of courage can ripple through time. I saw a young worker struggling with a heavy load, and I walked over to help him, remembering what it was like to be at the bottom and how important it is to help. My new office was located in a renovated warehouse, a space that felt honest and hardworking, filled with the smell of blueprints, fresh coffee, and the sound of productive and very meaningful collaboration. Arthur stopped by to discuss the blueprints for the new children's wing he wanted to build at the hospital, insisting that I be the lead designer for the entire project for the next year. He said it should be named after Mia, a tribute to her strength and a reminder to everyone that every life has an immeasurable value that cannot be calculated by a bank or accountant. I felt a lump in my throat as I started to draw the first lines of the design, realizing that my career had finally come full circle in the most beautiful and unexpected way possible. A few days later, a process server arrived at my office to inform me that Elena was officially filing for a modification of our custody agreement, suddenly wanting to be involved in Mia's life. I called Sarah, who laughed and told me that Elena didn't stand a chance in court given the mountain of evidence we had regarding her total abandonment of her daughter during a major health crisis. We prepared our countersuit not for revenge, but to ensure that Mia would never be subjected to her mother's toxic and manipulative behavior ever again as she continued her long and steady recovery process. I visited Julian in the county jail not to gloat, but to ask him if he finally understood the weight of the lives he had ruined with his illegal, greedy, and very short-sighted schemes. He looked broken and small, stripped of his expensive suits and his arrogance, and for a moment I felt a flicker of pity for the man who had lost everything for absolutely nothing. I reminded him that he could have been a builder instead of a thief, and that the city would have respected him more for a single honest brick than for all of his lies. As I left the jail, I saw Elena waiting in the parking lot, her hair disheveled and her clothes wrinkled, looking like a ghost of the woman she used to be just 2 weeks ago. She tried to run toward me, but my security team stepped in the way, a silent reminder that she no longer had access to me or the private world I now lived in today. I got into my car and drove away, focusing on the road ahead and the bright future that was waiting for Mia and me in our beautiful, new, and very safe home in Columbus. We moved into the house over the weekend, a simple but elegant place with plenty of light and a room for Mia that was decorated exactly the way she had always dreamed of having. I sat on the back porch that evening watching the sunset over the trees, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't felt since before the day Mia first got sick and our world broke. Arthur called to check in on us, his voice warm and grandfatherly, and we spent an hour talking about the future of the hospital project and the positive impact it would have on everyone. He mentioned that he had found the old foreman who had worked with us 20 years ago, and he wanted to invite him to the groundbreaking ceremony to honor the entire original crew members. I realized then that Arthur wasn't just rewarding me for saving his life. He was honoring a way of living that prioritized people over profits, and courage over convenient, easy, and cold-hearted cowardice. The groundbreaking ceremony was held on a crisp autumn morning, the air smelling of fallen leaves and the promise of a new beginning for all the children in our entire local Midwestern American community. Mia was there, standing next to me with a small shovel in her hand, her face glowing with health and happiness as she helped me turn the first piece of sacred dark earth together. I looked out at the crowd and saw the faces of the people I had worked with over the years, the men and women who had built this city with their own bare hands. I felt a deep sense of pride in my profession and in the fact that I had stayed true to my values, even when the world was trying to crush my very human spirit. As the ceremony ended, Arthur came over and shook my hand, his eyes shining with a quiet pride that told me everything I needed to know about our shared and long history together. I knew that there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt ready to face them, with my head held high and proud of me. The trial of Julian Vane began on a gray morning in November, and I sat in the front row of the courtroom, watching as the evidence of his massive fraud was finally presented today. Elena arrived wearing a much cheaper outfit than usual, her face pale and drawn as she realized that Julian's expensive lawyers were already preparing to sacrifice her to save his own failing skin. My attorney, Sarah, presented the clear records showing that Elena had knowingly used stolen funds to pay for her luxury lifestyle, while refusing to provide a single penny for our daughter's life-saving surgery. The judge looked at the medical bills and then at Elena with a cold, piercing disgust that made the entire courtroom go silent as the weight of her betrayal finally settled on her. Julian was eventually sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary, his assets were seized by the government, and his once mighty real estate empire was dismantled piece by piece over the following months. Because of the fraud, the mansion was officially foreclosed upon by the bank, and I watched from my car as the local sheriff posted the final eviction notice on those heavy oak doors. Elena was forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, the very kind of neighborhood she had mocked me for living in just a few months ago. She tried to reach out to her wealthy socialite friends for help, but they all turned their backs on her, wanting nothing to do with the scandal or the woman associated with it. I focused entirely on my work with Arthur, supervising the construction of the Mia Miller Pediatric Wing, ensuring that every steel beam and every concrete pour was handled with absolute perfect precision. We designed the facility to be a place of healing and hope, with bright colors, comfortable rooms for families, and the most advanced medical technology available in the entire country for children. Mia was getting stronger every single day, her cheeks finally regaining their healthy color as she began to walk and run without the constant, crushing fatigue that had defined her young life. She started school again in the spring, and I walked her to the front doors, watching as she laughed with her new friends, a sight that made all my sacrifices feel worth it. Arthur and I became close friends, often spending our Sunday afternoons talking about the future of the city and the legacy we wanted to leave behind for the next generation of builders. He told me that his own children had no interest in the family business, and he officially invited me to become a full partner in Sterling Development, with a substantial ownership stake tonight. I accepted the offer with a humble heart, knowing that I finally had the resources to protect Mia and to help other families who were struggling under the weight of medical debt. We established the Miller Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to providing financial assistance and legal support for parents whose children needed life-saving transplants but lacked the necessary insurance or personal funds. Elena appeared at my office one rainy afternoon, looking older and much more tired than I remembered, begging for a position as a receptionist or even a cleaning lady in my firm. I looked at her and remembered the cold way she had turned me away when I was at my lowest point, and I realized that I felt nothing but a quiet, distant pity. I told her that I couldn't hire her because our company values were based on integrity and selflessness, two qualities that she had proven she did not possess during our darkest family hour. I did, however, set up a small, anonymous trust that would pay for her basic living expenses, because I didn't want Mia's mother to be homeless, despite everything she had done to us. She never found out the money came from me, which was exactly the way I wanted it, as I had no desire for her gratitude or any further contact with her again. The custody hearing was brief and decisive, with the judge granting me full legal and physical custody of Mia, citing Elena's history of emotional neglect and her recent legal and financial troubles. Elena was allowed supervised visits once a month, but she rarely showed up, eventually moving away to another state to try and reinvent herself once again under a completely different, new name. Mia eventually stopped asking about her mother, focusing instead on her studies and her dream of becoming a doctor so she could help other children who were sick just like she was. The construction of the hospital wing was completed ahead of schedule, and the grand opening ceremony was attended by the governor and hundreds of families from all over the Midwestern United States. I stood on the stage next to Arthur and Mia, looking out at the beautiful building and realizing that something good had finally grown out of the ashes of my old broken life. I gave a short speech about the power of hope and the importance of never giving up on the people you love, no matter how difficult or impossible the situation might seem. After the ceremony, a young father approached me, his eyes filled with tears, and thanked me for the help the Miller Foundation had provided for his son's recent and successful heart surgery. That moment was worth more to me than any skyscraper I had ever built, or any amount of money I had ever earned in my 30 years as a professional structural construction engineer. Arthur retired later that year, leaving me in charge of the entire company, and I vowed to run it with the same honesty and compassion that he had shown to me personally. I hired several of my old crew members who had fallen on hard times, giving them steady work and a chance to rebuild their own lives with dignity and a fair wage. We focused on building affordable housing and community centers, projects that actually improved the lives of regular people, instead of just serving the interests of wealthy investors and corporate real estate developers. Mia graduated from high school with honors, and I watched with immense pride as she stood on the stage as the valedictorian, her voice clear and strong as she spoke to her classmates. She got into the best medical school in the country, and I made sure she had everything she needed to succeed, knowing that her future was finally as bright as her spirit. I bought a small cabin in the woods near the river, a place where Arthur and I could go fishing and enjoy the quiet peace of the nature that we both loved. I often sat on the porch in the evenings thinking about the long journey I had traveled and the people who had helped me along the way when I had nothing left. I realized that the price of a life isn't measured in dollars or property, but in the love we give and the sacrifices we are willing to make for those we hold dear. Elena eventually passed away in a small town in Florida, and I flew down to handle the arrangements, ensuring she had a dignified service even though she had died alone and forgotten. I stood by her grave for a long time, forgiving her in my heart for the pain she had caused, realizing that her own greed had been its own terrible and lonely punishment. I returned to Columbus and threw myself back into my work, knowing that there were still so many other families who needed a hand up and a reason to keep on believing. Sterling Development became the most respected firm in the region, known for our high ethical standards and our commitment to the communities we served with every single one of our building projects. I kept the old medical folders in a safe in my office, a reminder of where I had come from and why I worked so hard to protect the vulnerable and the weak. One day, I received a letter from a woman who had worked for Elena as a maid, telling me that she had always admired my strength and the way I loved Mia. She said that even in that cold mansion she could see that I was the one with the true wealth, and her words brought a quiet smile to my face that afternoon. Mia became a renowned pediatric surgeon, and she eventually joined the staff at the hospital wing that bore her name, continuing the legacy of healing that we had started together today. We walked through the halls together one afternoon, and she told me that I was her hero, not because of the money, but because I never stopped fighting for her life and future. I looked at the children playing in the hospital courtyard, and I knew that every struggle, every tear, and every moment of despair had led us to this beautiful and meaningful place. Arthur lived to see the birth of Mia's first child, a healthy baby boy whom she named after him and me, a tribute to the two men who had changed her world. He passed away peacefully in his sleep a few months later, and the entire city turned out for his funeral to honor the man who had built so much more than buildings. I was named the executor of his estate, and I spent the following year ensuring that his charitable legacy continued to grow and thrive in the way he had always intended it. I moved out of the luxury penthouse and back into a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, preferring a simpler life that allowed me to focus on what truly mattered to me. I spent my weekends teaching young engineers about the importance of ethics and the responsibility they had to build a better and more just world for everyone in their own local communities. My name is Thomas Miller, and I am a man who once lost everything but his dignity, only to find that dignity is the most valuable asset any human being can possess. I often visit the bus stop where I sat in the rain, not to dwell on the past, but to remember the moment my life changed and the stranger who became my brother. I keep a picture of Mia and me on my desk, a snapshot of us from the day we turned the first earth for the new hospital wing, both of us smiling. The scars on my hands have faded over the years, but the lessons I learned through my suffering are etched deeply into my character and the way I choose to live now. I finally understand that a man's true worth is determined by the lives he touches and the kindness he shows to those who are standing alone in the cold and dark. My life is now filled with a quiet, steady joy, the kind that comes from knowing you have done your best and that you have left the world a little better. Mia and her family come over for dinner every Sunday, and the sound of my grandson's laughter filling the house is the greatest music I have ever heard in my entire life. We talk about the future and the dreams they have, and I feel a deep sense of contentment knowing that they are safe, loved, and fully supported in everything they do. I am 80 years old now, and as I look back on my journey, I realize that the hardest moments were the ones that actually prepared me for the greatest blessings. I never sought revenge against Elena or Julian, because I learned that living a good and honorable life is the best answer to any act of cruelty or betrayal one faces. I have built many things in my life, from skyscrapers to hospitals, but my greatest achievement will always be the daughter I saved and the love that we share as a family. I sit on my porch as the sun sets over the city I helped build, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for every single person who walked beside me during this journey. The rain no longer feels cold to me, but instead reminds me of the cleansing power of hope and the way a new beginning can always be found in a storm. I am ready for whatever comes next, knowing that I have lived with integrity and that I have fulfilled my duty to my child and to the community that gave much. I close my eyes and I can still hear the sound of the bus approaching in the rain, the moment when a life of struggle turned into a life of light. I am Thomas Miller, an engineer, a father, and a man who believes that the price of a life is something that can only be measured by the depth of heart. I walk inside my house, the warmth of the home welcoming me, and I prepare for another day of work and another opportunity to be a force for good today. The blueprints for our next project are spread out on the table, a new community center for veterans, and I feel the old excitement of building something new and meaningful. I am blessed beyond measure, and I never forget the lessons I learned when I had nothing but $34 in my pocket and a daughter who needed me. My story is one of betrayal and suffering, but it is also a story of redemption, loyalty, and the incredible power of a single act of kindness to change everything. I hope that when people hear my story, they find the courage to keep fighting for what they believe in and to always treat others with respect and dignity today. The world can be a harsh and unforgiving place, but it can also be a place of incredible beauty and grace if we only have the eyes to see. I am finally at peace, knowing that I have lived a life worth living and that my legacy will continue through the many children who are now healthy and happy.